Welcome to History 1301. We're talking now about the Civil War. We're going to go ahead and get kicked off into the Civil War. Our lead-in slide goes like this. We're going to be talking first about the Lincoln's administration. In the previous series, we got all the way up to the Civil War, and our thesis statement was, what was the South ready, willing, and able to do to hold on to slavery? And as we're going to see, once we get the Lincoln administration up and going, they're going to be ready, willing, and able to go ahead and secede. We'll talk about Lincoln's immediate reaction to that. Then we'll talk about the plans. The Northern plan for the war is going to be the Anaconda Plan. We'll go ahead and talk about what the South is up to, what they're thinking on this. And they really don't have a plan, so we'll have to take a look at what they have to say. Then we'll transition. We'll talk about the men, the face of the Civil War. This is kind of a sociological approach to the Civil War. And we did the same thing with the Revolution. If you'll recall, we talked about Joseph Plum Martin. We'll do kind of the same thing for the Civil War. We'll talk about a couple of key figures. They're just icons of the Civil War. Then we'll get on to the fighting. We'll have the first Battle of Bull Run. Then we'll talk about some other things, the finance of the war primarily. Then we'll talk about the Peninsula Campaign, and then we'll talk about contrabands. Now, a note on your note-taking, once again, we'll be talking about various issues that are associated with the Civil War, and then we'll talk about a battle. And then we'll talk about other issues associated with the Civil War, and then we'll have another battle. Again, it's not going to be battle, 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 battle. That's like, you can't remember that. You can't like really focus in on any single battle that way. They all run together. So I'll try to intersperse issues associated with the Civil War in between the battles. But for most of you who are listening to this, you're in preparation for a test. And so be prepared to go back into your notes, take out all of the major battles that we talk about and put them kind of in one place. And then the other issues, have them in various separate places. And so just be prepared to do that as we continue on through the Civil War. Now, for technical reasons, that is to say, uploading into YouTube, as you can imagine, I can't do the entire Civil War, which runs several hours, and then upload that into YouTube. So I've divided the Civil War into 3 parts. It basically goes everything up to the Gettysburg Campaign. And then we get into 1864, and then I'll have, that'll be another presentation. In other words, it'll be everything up to Gettysburg, not Gettysburg. But then the second presentation, part 2, will be Gettysburg, and then on to 1864. And then 1864 to 1865 will be the last presentation. So it's divided up into 3 parts. Don't get them confused. Try to watch them in order. And with that in mind, let's get on with the Lincoln's administration. Let's get on to the first slide. So we're talking now about the election of 1860. We've got to get Lincoln into control. And I've mentioned this on several occasions before. Let me reiterate this right now, kind of remind you what's really going on here. The South could never control the House of Representatives and Congress. They simply didn't have the population, even when you count slaves in the 3/5 rule. The South could never control the House of Representatives. But they always tried to keep control, a lot of power in the Senate. That was the Missouri Compromise in 1821. And we've already talked about how the Missouri Compromise had to go away. So because Oregon came in, California came in, Minnesota came in, and there was no other slave state entering the Union at the time, then the South has subsequently lost control of the Senate. So the only place where they have any meaningful authority left is the presidency, and they'd always been able to control that, right up to when Buchanan was the president. Buchanan was very conservative, he was very Southern leaning. But then in the election of 1860, as you can see, a dynamic has changed. The North came alive to the realization that they were being really put upon by the South. In other words, the South was saying, you've got to accept all the rules about preserving the institution of slavery, or, kind of bad things are going to happen to you. So we had a very much divided election. And I want you to take a look at the pie chart where it talks about the popular vote. As you can see in the key below, the popular vote was divided in 4 different ways. So there's going to be Northern Democrats, and those are going to go for Douglas. But as I pointed out before, Douglas, though he's a Northern Democrat, he can't support slavery. So nobody in the South is going to go for him. Then the Southern Democrats are going to go for Breckinridge. Well, Breckinridge had been Buchanan's vice president, but he just couldn't control enough votes. Nobody in the North was going to vote for him. Then you had the Constitutional Union, which is a splinter group, and this is under Bell, and Bell just didn't have enough votes for anything. He's trying to like make a compromise, be a compromise candidate, and he doesn't have enough votes. So the North is going to have a lot of votes. But take a look at that. Again, that middle pie chart, that lower pie chart, 40% are going to vote for Lincoln. So to be clear, in the popular vote, 60% of the people voted against Lincoln. 60% voted against him. The problem was, obviously, that 60% is divided between three other parties. The Southern Democrats, the Northern Democrats, and the Constitutional Union, whatever that thing was. A third party that came out of nowhere. But with that in mind, as you all know, because we've talked about this many times, you don't win in the popular vote. The popular vote influences the Electoral College, but that's where the votes are at. That's where you win. And as you can see, Lincoln won with 59, it was like 59.8%, so essentially 60% of the Electoral College, because all of those northern states control the Electoral College votes. And for that, take a strong look at the map. You can see that New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Massachusetts, if you win those three states, you really don't have to win anything else, because that's where all the Electoral College votes were at. Focus on, compare that to those states that are down there in that kind of green color. What, North Carolina's got 10, Florida's got 3, Texas has 4. That's not enough. There's just not enough Electoral College votes in the South to overcome the North. If you carry New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, which Lincoln obviously he did, and Massachusetts with 13 Electoral College votes, you know, Massachusetts, a small state, has more Electoral College votes than it, than the highest one in that first tier of states that are going to leave, in Georgia, for example. So Virginia, they weren't going to vote South, then we're going to vote North. So they voted for this third party. Well, those were wasted votes in my view. So there's Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia, the most populous states that are slave states, but they didn't go for the South. They didn't go for Breckinridge. So while Lincoln, what I really want you guys to get out of this slide, what Lincoln did not win was the popular vote. But he won where it counted, and that's the Electoral College vote. So to summarize then, the South never controlled the House of Representatives. Then, in the 1850s, they lost control of the Senate when California, Oregon, and Minnesota came in. And then in the election of 1860, they lost control of the White House. And their underlying fear of the South is that the North, now dominant in the legislation and in the presidency, is going to find a mechanism, going to find a way to take away their slaves. And this is not true, as you're about to find out. But the South was absolutely paranoid about this. They were just crazy about this issue. So that brings Lincoln into office. That's how it worked. Okay? So with that in mind, let's take a look at what happens now that Lincoln's in charge. So what we're looking at here is Lincoln's inaugural address. Now, obviously, the inaugural address, March 3rd, 1861, it goes on for a long, long time. But what I want to drive at here is a singular point. And we're going to take a look at what Lincoln says, and then we're going to take a look at why he said what he said. Let's take a look in Lincoln's inaugural address, which of this is a part. We're going to take a look at what he said, and then we're going to discover why he said it. Now, take a look at this. Lincoln comes across today in our American mythology as this abolitionist. He's the man that freed all the slaves. But here we are at the very beginning of his administration, and he has a completely different dynamic that he has to contend with. So take a look at what he says. Quote, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. Plainly, the idea of secession is the essence of anarchy. Physically speaking, we cannot separate. Men and women may divorce, but the different parts of our country may not do this. Now, that part right there, those last couple of sentences there, this is Lincoln being the speaker. This is Lincoln being the poet. This is his word crafting. In other words, he's making it into an analogy that the common man can understand. And this is storytelling, and it's really going to play well. He's saying that, listen, men and women, they can get away from each other. They can escape. But the country, what's the South going to pick up and go to Argentina? They can't do that. So then he goes on to say, we are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Now, I want you guys to use your powers of analysis here, because we've talked about this before. And I know that this is what Lincoln's thinking about because he wrote about this later. He understood what was going on with that cycle of war in Europe. And we've talked about this on many occasions. And Lincoln did not want that sort of thing to happen here. He knew that if the South ever did successfully split, that America would get into that cycle of war. There'd be a casus belli, a war would, they would gather allies, presumably from Europe. Then a war would break out. We would fight to exhaustion, then have a peace treaty, and then it would just go on and on and on. Every few years, we'd find something. The South would have something that the North wanted, or the North would have something the South wanted. We'd be fighting over territory, over land, over something. And Lincoln says we can't do that. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. And then again, it's Lincoln the poet. The mystic chords of memory will yet swell the chorus of union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our natures. In this last part, the better angel of our nature, what he's saying is, listen, let cooler heads prevail. This is a message directly to the South. Don't do what you're trying to do. Don't do this. Think it all the way through. Let's work it out. He's trying to tell the South, I'm not the man you think I am. I'm not the man that, the politicians and the screamers and the newspaper editorials have been making me out to be. I'm not that way at all. Let's talk. Let's work this out. So with that in mind, this is what Lincoln says. Now let's step half a step back and find out why Lincoln said what he said. Let's go on to the next slide and see why he's saying what he's saying. So here we are. We're taking a look now at a map that shows the southern states that are going to secede. Now, as a reminder, let me put this into the proper perspective. What's going on this map is still in the Buchanan administration. This is before Lincoln actually takes over. He takes over in March 1861, and so let's take a look at what was going on here. Now, the election was in November 1860. As I've indicated on several occasions before, as a reminder, it takes a long time to count the votes back in those days. So the vote was on the very first part of November 1860. It took forever for them to count all the votes up, send in all of the returns. Then you have to go to the Electoral College, and they have to cast their votes. That's a separate step. So it's going to be, December anyway, before anybody actually knew what the real results were going to be, especially in an election like this, where there's such a difference between the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. 60% of the people are going to vote against Lincoln, but 60% of the Electoral College vote will go for Lincoln. So here we are, December 20th, South Carolina. They've discussed this, and there's fire debate after fire debate. And finally, on the 20th of December, South Carolina is going to secede from the Union. Now, please write down a strong note here. There is a mechanism involved with this. The people are going to tell their state representatives, this is what we want to do. Other people will talk to their state senators, and they'll say, this is what we want to do. And so the governor is going to get informed about what the people of that state want. This is all about states' rights. So the state legislature, in this case of South Carolina, introduced a bill of secession. It went before the state legislature, then it went to the governor, and he signed it. And then that was it. That was state law. South Carolina has seceded from the Union. Well, this, in my view, is what makes Buchanan the worst president we will ever have or ever will have had. This guy did not lift a finger to stop that. He was conservative, okay, fine, but he also had a constitutional duty to uphold the law, to protect the Constitution. And secession, while it's not specifically forbidden, all the steps necessary to do a secession are. And he did not uphold that. So the point I'm trying to make here is South Carolina got away with it. Please write that down. South Carolina introduced a bill into their legislature. It went before the governor and he signed it. And they got away with it. Buchanan did not lift a finger to stop this. Well, South Carolina having gotten away with it, take a look at all the other states that are going to follow right away. You know, it's Christmas, everybody's home for Christmas. But then Mississippi is going to do it, then Alabama, then Georgia, Louisiana, Florida, they're all going to leave the Union right away. Then in February, Texas leaves the Union against the strenuous objections of the then governor, Sam Houston. Sam Houston was the governor, and he tried repeatedly to keep this from happening, but he couldn't. And so Texas leaves the Union. So again, all those blue states leaving the Union, that is before Lincoln was in office. That's before he was in office. So then he gets into office, and North Carolina leaves, then Tennessee. Well, you can see it up there. Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina. Virginia was the last of the holdouts, really. And they waited and waited and waited until basically Lincoln called for troops. And when Lincoln called for troops, that put Virginia over the top. Virginia was going to go to the south anyway. But they waited and waited and waited and went over the top. Now, you'll notice that West Virginia, that kind of deep purple color, I suppose, bear in mind that that was part of Virginia at the time. And West Virginia is very, very northern leaning. And that's what held Virginia out for so long. Now, I want to take a moment now and point out these states that are in that kind of deep blue-green color. We'll start with Maryland, then we'll go to Kentucky and Missouri. Now, Delaware is on there, but we're not going to talk about Delaware because there was like less than 200 slaves in all of Delaware. But Maryland was a slave state. And Lincoln obviously could not allow that state to go to the south. The reason why, Washington, D.C. is basically surrounded on three sides by Maryland, and the fourth side by the Potomac River. On the other side of the Potomac is Virginia. So Lincoln could not allow Maryland to go. And in order to keep Maryland, which was probably leaning towards the south, they were southern leaning, to keep them from going into the south, he sent troops in. And he said, listen, you know, he gave orders to the various army units that were in the area. If anybody tries to have this vote, I want them arrested. And he talked to the governor and he worked it all out. So anybody who was actually going to try to vote for secession, that was going to be stopped. And Maryland, again, very much leaning towards the south, especially Baltimore, they were not going to, you know, they went ahead and remained in the Union. But it's due to basically brute force. Now let's go on to Kentucky. There's a couple of things going on here in Kentucky, and Lincoln had to play a very, very careful game here. Kentucky was really neutral. They're northern leaning on their northern border. That kind of wiggly line on the northern border, that's the Ohio River. And Lincoln could not allow the Ohio River, this highway, this river that's going right through the heart of America, he could not let that fall under Confederate control. So he's talking very carefully to the people of Kentucky. He has a strong connection with the people of Kentucky. His wife is from there. And he's trying to figure out exactly how to work this out. And so he must have Kentucky within the Union. But Kentucky signaled that they wanted to remain neutral throughout this entire affair. They didn't want to have anything to do with it, which was improbable or even impossible. Strong note here now. Kentucky, the state of Kentucky said, and their governor said, listen, if anybody tries to invade, then we will go for the other side. So if the South tries to pull some shenanigan, we'll go for the North. If the North tries to pull some stunt, then we'll go for the South. And as luck would have it, Southern generals in Tennessee, operating in Tennessee, figured that the Kentucky was about to go to the North. They misread the situation. And so Confederate forces in Tennessee invaded Kentucky. And immediately then Kentucky, an otherwise undecided state, went for the Union. And so that was a big relief to Lincoln. But he kept saying, listen, if Kentucky's going to go towards the Confederacy, then we will immediately, we're going to go into Lexington, the then capital of Kentucky, and we're going to arrest everybody, and that's going to be that. And we're going to keep Kentucky in the Union no matter what. But happily, the South overplayed their hand, and Kentucky's going to stay loyal to the Union. The last one is Missouri. Now, Missouri was a slave state. It had always been a slave state. But the governor of Missouri at the time was none other than John C. Fremont. That's F-R-E with that little accent above it, M-O-N-T. John C. Fremont, F-R-E, accent mark, M-O-N-T. Now, John C. Fremont had been a general in the Army for many years. His nickname was the Pathfinder. He's one of these Western explorers. He'd been with the Army, he'd been stationed out in California for a while, and he's going to be, at the time, he's going to be the governor of Missouri. And here, Lincoln has kind of a mixed blessing. Fremont wants to go back to the Army and fight, but he's going to, take action as a governor of Missouri. And so he proclaims that Missouri will absolutely not pass any law of secession. And he says to the legislature, I'm not going to allow you to do that. And if anybody does try that, they're going to be arrested. And if anybody does try to resist the arrest, they're going to be shot as a traitor. So John C. Fremont, he did a big service to Lincoln and the cause of the Union. And he kept Missouri loyal kind of the hard way through brute force. Basically the threat of, hanging anybody that tried to go to the Confederacy. So even though Missouri is very much a slave state, it's going to remain loyal. But then, unfortunately for Lincoln, and this is what I mean when it was kind of a mixed bag here, it's sort of a mixed blessing, John C. Fremont took the next step. And I want to be clear on this. He understood, as many do and many should, everybody should understand this, the war was fought over slavery, and he understood that. So he said, okay, well, to get rid of that problem, he will personally, as the governor of the state of Missouri, proclaim emancipation for all the slaves within Missouri. And this is very much a conservative, sort of a states' rights idea that the governor should be able to do that. So he issued an emancipation proclamation on his own responsibility, on his own recognition as the governor of the state of Missouri. Well, this put Lincoln in a very, very tight spot, because an emancipation proclamation of that nature was almost certainly unconstitutional, and Lincoln knew it. On the other hand, he needs to keep John C. Fremont loyal, which was going to happen. He was pretty sure of that. And but more importantly, not upset Northerners who were fighting to end slavery. He didn't want to upset the abolitionists, who were a core part of the party, the Republican Party at the time. But he had to very quietly send a strong message to John C. Fremont, the governor of Missouri. Listen, you need to rescind that. So when we think of Abraham Lincoln as, the guy that emancipated all the slaves, well, please understand that there's, that's not the way it was up front. Lincoln was trying to stop the war from happening. He was trying to head it off. And to do that, strong note here, he has to send a message to the South. So he told John C. Fremont, rescind this Emancipation Proclamation, and let's work it out, kind of in a more constitutional way. And Fremont, again, to his everlasting credit, did that. But we can't think of Lincoln as just, setting out in this terrible, terrible conflict to emancipate the slaves. Because here's John C. Fremont, who did, and then Lincoln said, no, you gotta kind of pull back from that. So it's not that the slaves were ever, re-enslaved. This is really a document battle. Nobody let go of their slaves in Missouri. Nobody did that. So again, Missouri is coming into the Union, but they're bringing a lot of problems with them, and that's going to cause Lincoln a lot of heartache over the next, 6 to 8 months, the first 6 to 8 months of the war, because John C. Fremont's going to be wanting to run his own war effort out there in Missouri. So this is one of the things that Lincoln is really arguing, the message that he has to deal with, the message that he has to send to the South. I'm not the man that you think that I am. And again, that's the import. That's the element of that previous slide where we had his inaugural address. So with that in mind, let's go on to the next slide and see, Lincoln's got a whole plate full of things that he has to contend with right away. So let's go on to the next slide and work out what happens next. The North had a plan for the war, and it's going to be called the Anaconda Plan. This will be the big contribution of none other than General Winfield Scott, whose picture you see there on the lower left. Now, Winfield Scott had been in the Army since 1819, and here we are in 1861. He'd been a very senior general for a very long time, highly influential in the early development of the U.S. Army. He insisted on West Point as a military academy. He was instrumental in its beginning. But here we are in 1861, and he went to Lincoln and confessed. He says, listen, I'm too old and too overweight and just too broken down to be able to be the one who leads you as a military man into this conflict. And ironically, Lincoln said, well, who would you then recommend? And Winfield Scott said, to my dying day, I would recommend Robert E. Lee. Lincoln offered Robert E. Lee command of all Union forces, but Robert E. Lee went with his state, which was Virginia, instead. The big contribution of Winfield Scott is the Anaconda Plan. And as you can imagine, an anaconda, the way it kills its victim is through constriction. And so this plan is going to work perfectly. Please make sure you get that into your notes. Very rarely do military operations work the way they're planned. Certainly, getting the thing executed was, as iffy as we're going to discover. But the plan itself worked to perfection. And the map that you see there in the middle of the image, it's from the era. That illustration in the upper left, that's Jefferson Davis with the horns of the devil sticking out of the top, with none other than McClellan as the head of the snake. That's not going to really work out. But it's a cartoon that shows that the Anaconda Plan was well known to everyone. And the map shows it, again, just extremely well. We're just going to isolate the South by putting a bunch of ships out there to close off all the harbors, close off all the ports. No ships in, no ships out. And this was critical because the South had very little manufacturing. And so they needed guns and equipment, especially gunpowder, cannons. They needed every species of equipment. And that really had to come in from Europe, primarily, again, ironically, from Great Britain. The snake winds itself around, and again, they're going to cut it off from the north, and they're just going to continue. The Union will just commence to slicing off bits and pieces of the Confederacy. It'll slice off Texas. The Oklahoma Territory is going to slice off Arkansas and then Louisiana. Then there's going to be an attempt to slice off Florida. And then they'll go through Tennessee and northern Mississippi, Alabama, until finally Georgia, North and South Carolina, and Virginia are all that's left. And that'll be in 1865. So the Anaconda Plan is going to work very, very well indeed. Now, strong note here. Lincoln had two goals for the war. End the war quickly and preserve the Union. I will say that again. Lincoln had two goals for the war. End the war quickly and preserve the Union. When we talk about emancipation, that will emerge later on in the conflict. But up front, Lincoln had two goals for the war: preserve the Union and end the war quickly. All right, well, with that in mind, let's go ahead and see what the South has in mind for this conflict. Now, the South had no meaningful plan for the war, but they did have a concept. And their concept, they had no strategy for the war, but they did have a concept. Now, the concept goes like this: allow the North to attack the South. Allow the North to come down to the South. And presumably, the South would be able to then defeat the North somewhere in the South. They would defeat the North in battle. And the consequence of that over time is that the North would finally become so fed up with the war that they would simply let the South go their own way. That is their concept. It's not really a plan. Let the North come down to the South. They will subsequently be defeated in battle. And then the North will finally get war weary and give up the fight and allow the South to go their own way. Now, as a concept, it's not bad. It's a little bit on the defensive. But Jefferson Davis, in articulating this concept, he's like, listen, we have to play to our strengths. This is what we could do. The idea of invading the North and like conquering from a position of strength, the South just did not have that. Now, strong note here. In broad terms, the terrain was on the side of the South. In broad terms, the terrain was on the side of the South. And what I mean by that is all these rivers. The South is shot through north, south, east, and west with rivers. And so to get at the South, the North is going to have to cross one river after another, after another, after another. And again and again and again, the North will find themselves in a position that part of their army is on one side of a river and the other part of their army is on the other side of the river. Well, then all that the Confederacy has to do, all the South, also known as the Confederacy, all they have to do is gang up on the one side that's trapped on one side of a river. And that's going to very nearly happen on many, many occasions. Many times, the North will will fight with a river to their backs, and that's like really, really dangerous militarily. If you're fighting a battle and you happen to lose, you've got a river at your back, and you either got to get across that river or you're going to be destroyed and just pushed into the drink, and that's not going to work very well. Furthermore, I want to draw your attention to that kind of striped area. If you'll look at the eastern edge of it, you'll find the Shenandoah Valley. And the bottom end of the Shenandoah Valley opens up into Virginia. And that's the opening of it. And so in Virginia, the South could funnel a bunch of troops into the Shenandoah River Valley. And if you kind of follow all those like dotted lines sort of thing, that's the Shenandoah River Valley. And it lets out in Pennsylvania. And like this is like a really, really big deal because that's the industrial heart of the North. And so if the South funnels troops in at the bottom of the Shenandoah River Valley, it's very rich, there's lots of food there, lots of supplies, then they'll go to the north and be able to attack in the heart of the North. By contrast, if the North funnels troops into the northern end of the Shenandoah River Valley and they emerge in the South, there's really nothing there. If you're in that part of North Carolina or that part of Southern Virginia, regionally, that's referred to as pine barrens, and there is nothing there. There's no food really, just a little bit of pasturage for your animals, and there's there's nothing there. There's no big cities. There's nothing there. So the South kind of had that advantage as well. So the terrain, in many ways, not entirely obviously, but the terrain works in many ways on behalf of the South. But ultimately, they had no real plan for the war. Just hang on and hope that the North will finally give up. And they kept saying that right until 1864, 1865. So with that in mind, let's move forward. Now, in class, I talk about this as a piece of like image analysis. And as you all know, I'm really big on image analysis. And I ask people, okay, what do you see in this picture? And the invariable answer is, well, a broken down fence, a sort of a corral or whatever, presumably a little bit of an orchard, and just a bunch of open field. And that's exactly what's being shown here. But this is the Bull Run battlefield. You're looking at the Bull Run battlefield, and it's going to be fought over, actually, 3 or 4 separate times. It'll be called different battles, but it's going to be fought over. That same ground will be fought over several times. And what I want you guys to get out of this image is there's nothing strategic there. Open fields, a snake rail fence, that's all that's there. And so when we talk about the Civil War and these various battles, strong note here, or just keep this in the back of your mind. We're only fighting at these locations, with very few exceptions. We're only fighting at the various locations where we're going to be fighting at because the enemy army is there. At Antietam, there's nothing at Antietam. The town of Sharpsburg is inconsequential to the war. It's not a manufacturing center or anything. But we're going to fight at Antietam because that's where the Southern Army ran into the Northern Army. And so they fought a gigantic, titanic battle there. Gettysburg, no difference. It's a village, 1,300 people, a tiny little college out there in the middle of Pennsylvania. And we're going to fight a titanic struggle there only because that's where the armies ran into one another. Shiloh, no different. Resaca, no different. It's just one battle after another is only being fought because the armies collide with one another at those locations. So with that in mind, let's go talk about the first Battle of Bull Run. So here we have it, the first Battle of Bull Run. Now let me set this up. And in your note taking, understand that I try to do this in a methodical way. It'll be the background of the battle, it'll be both sides, what they're doing, then the outcome of the battle, and then what it means. Very much like a court case. What's the background to it? What are the two sides? What's the outcome of it? And then what does it mean? So here we are. We're in early, or I guess mid 1861, and Lincoln is looking desperately to get this over with quickly. Again, his motive is to end the war quickly and preserve the Union. So he's looking around for a general, and he selects Irvin McDowell. He couldn't get, Winfield Scott was too old and too overweight. Robert E. Lee had gone for the South. So Lincoln's looking around for a general, and he finds Irvin McDowell, I-R-V-I-N. McDowell is on that upper part of the map, right in the big fat middle where all those little black squares are clustered. Irvin McDowell. And he said to Irving McDowell, listen, we have all these volunteers, we have all these men. I want you to take them down there and beat the South right now. Go capture Richmond and defeat the South immediately. Go do it right now. Now, McDowell, he objected. And he said, listen, we do not have the army for that right now. We have a lot of men, and a lot of these men have guns. But that does not equal an army. And Lincoln replied very famously, he said, you are green, that is to say unripe. You are green, but they are green as well. You are all green together. Now go down there and beat them. What Lincoln was saying, and please make a strong note on this, what Lincoln was saying is, don't let the South have time or opportunity to train their men up. Go beat them now and end this war. So then, under those circumstances, Irving McDowell, he had no choice. He had to go attack. So they go, marching out of Washington, D.C., where they were stationed at. The flags are snapping in the breeze. The bugles are blowing. The drums are beating. And the men march out. Well, on this map, Washington, D.C. is kind of to the upper right, just off the map. It's just about 20 miles away, not even. And so they're marching and marching and marching. The Union Army is under McDowell. They're marching to the South. Well, strong note here. The South had a whole lot of spies, loyalists to the South, in and around Washington, D.C. And that will be a problem throughout the entire war. There's spies everywhere that are reporting everything to the South. Furthermore, and one of our generals that we talk about later on is going to be William Tecumseh Sherman. He's going to hate this. But we did have a free and open press. And the free and open press, they have reporters everywhere, and any little camp rumor or something they pick up, they're going to report right away. It's going to get into the newspapers. So if you're in the South, all you got to do is pick up a newspaper to find out what the Yankees, what the Northern guys, what the Union Army is up to. So here comes Irving McDowell. He's marching down there. He's heading for Richmond, which is off the map, I guess, to the lower right, about, 20 or 30 miles off the map. Not far away. The South has been alerted to the fact that the North, under Irving McDowell, is marching towards them. So a couple of their more famous generals, one named Pierre Gustave Toton Beauregard, he's going to show up. We've talked about him before. I love that name, Pierre Gustave Toton Beauregard. You can see him down there. And the other general, a little bit more senior, and the other general is going to be Joe Johnson. Now, Beauregard shows up. He starts calling for help. Units come from all over the place. This is one of the first times in war that railroads are going to play a major role because a lot of units will show up by rail. Johnson will be near the railroads. He's going to unload the guys and have them march up. Then Beauregard will take the guys that are marching up from the railroad and actually throw them into action. So the fight goes on and the fight goes on, and they're all lined up. You can see on that lower part of the map there, they're all lined up and they're fighting and fighting and fighting. Well, as the fight goes on for a while, the way it works out is that somewhere along the line, we'll never know who it was, but one of the Union soldiers threw down his rifle and started running. And when one guy throws down his rifle and starts running, everybody else throws down their rifles and start running as well. And this event is called the Great Skedaddle. Now, skedaddle is a made-up American word, so spell it however you want. S-K-D, daddle. The Great Skedaddle. So the Union guys, they all break and they all run, and it's just kind of what McDowell had anticipated would happen. They start heading back to Washington, D.C. The rain comes along. It's terrible, terrible, terrible retreat. Because the battlefield itself is so close to Washington, D.C., many congressmen and senators are going to be out there to watch the battle as though it were a football game or something. You know, they brought fried chicken dinners and champagne and this and that and the other. So many of these congressmen and senators all saw the retreat. They got caught up in it. So what I want you guys to get out of the Battle of Bull Run, it was a tremendous Confederate victory, and the South is encouraged. Now, hopefully this has a sort of a familiar ring to it. If you will look back in your notes at the Battle of Bunker Hill and Breeds Hill and the Battle of Lexington Concord, all the way back in the American War of Independence, that's what gave the Americans their encouragement to continue on with the war. Well, that will happen no different here. In other words, their concept of the War of the South, that's actually working out in the first, big try. The North went down to the South. This is all happening in Virginia. The Union Army is defeated. Everybody knew it as they ran off, left all their cannons and muskets and all their equipment on the battlefield and ran for it. And so the South is greatly encouraged. That's all I really want you guys to get out of the first Battle of Bull Run. The South is encouraged. Well, there are consequences to this, and it establishes a precedent. And that is what we're going to explore on the next slide. So, Lincoln has a defeat on his hands. And the senators and congressmen, they're all really mad about this. They're hopping mad. They've gotten all these guys together. They've given them all those sorts of equipment. And then they set them out there and they got beat, and not only beat, but beat badly, and they ran for it. So this establishes a precedent. In your notes, kind of along the margin or someplace, write down, I want you guys to start to compile a list of Union generals. And the first general I want you guys to write down is Irvin McDowell. Strong note here. Irvin McDowell got put in charge. He lost at the first Battle of Bull Run, and he got fired. And that is the precedent. Now that leads us to what's going on in this slide. You'll see there in the middle is President Lincoln. He goes down to visit the Army, and there he is. The first thing I kind of want you guys to notice about this, if you look in the photograph, you'll see that many of their feet is kind of level to one another. That suggests that they're the same distance from the camera. But I want you guys to note, and it's perfectly obvious, how much taller Lincoln is than anybody else. Lincoln was 6'3", which is tall even today. But look how much shorter everybody else is. They can't be more than about 5'4", 5'5", 5'6". Well, the other individual I want to draw your attention to is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th one from the left. The sixth guy from the left, who's looking directly at Lincoln. Now, his name is George B. McClellan. I'll have his name spelled up on a slide coming up in just a moment. George B. McClellan. Now, McClellan had done well in a couple of battles before. He had been in the West Point Military Academy. He'd gone off and worked to the railroads as an engineer. He'd done really well. But then the war comes along, and he says, okay, well, I'm going to go back and, join the Army and try and do the right thing for the Union. He was a northern man, I believe, from Mississippi. From Ohio, I think. But quite possibly Massachusetts. Don't hold me to that. Anyway, he was, a loyal soldier, and he's going to go down there. He does well in a couple of battles. And so after Irving McDowell got beat, Lincoln, he's looking for somebody, and he put George B. McClellan in charge. Now, this was a mistake, but Lincoln did not know that at the time. So McClellan's going to take over, and that is the precedent. If a general gets defeated, they get fired. And that's going to lead to a whole lot of generals. Now, we're going to get to the South and what they're doing with their generals in a moment. But for the North, understand that part of the premise of the Northern war effort,
Lincoln has all of these advantages, and he did. He had many advantages. Every author talks about this. But he could not translate those advantages into battlefield victory. And Irving McDowell is one example of them, and we're going to have a whole lot of examples moving forward. Lincoln had every advantage that the North could give. More men, more supplies, more money. He had everything that he needed to fight a war. But he could not translate that into battlefield victory. So with that in mind, let's move forward. Now, what we're going to talk about now is 1862, the first full year of the war. McClellan's in charge. He begins to train and train and train and train and train. And when he gets done training his men, he trains them some more. And so we're going to veer away from talking about battles for a minute. I've mentioned this before. We're going to have a battle, and then we'll talk about other things. Then we'll have a battle, and we'll talk about other things. Well, we're going to talk about other things now. We're going to talk about supplies and the economics of the war. We'll spend a lot of time on that. Then we'll have another battle, the Peninsula Campaign. And then I'll have a very short few things to say on Hampton Roads, which is the war at sea, which is also very important. Then we'll talk about contrabands and the Emancipation Proclamation. Then we'll move on to Antietam. We'll talk about some other things, then we'll move on to Shiloh. So that's where we're at. Now, we're going to talk about supplies and economics of the war next. For heaven's sakes, don't fall asleep. Now, if you're in class, I'm prepared to give you the next slide as a handout. But here, you might be able to give yourself a full screen if you want to do this, and then find a way to print a screenshot. And that's how you can get this as a handout if you're at home. So let's talk about supplies and the economics of the war. All right. Now, this is a very complex slide, and we're going to spend a lot of time on it. And so I want to draw your attention first to the scales of the two bar charts. On the left, figure 4 is showing the scale. If you look at the top, that's $1 billion. And that's all the revenue of the Confederate government, 1861 to 64. And that's $1 billion. But the scale in figure 3 on the other side is $1 billion too. So the scales are different. They're slightly different. But let's take a look at what's really going on here. Strong note. During this period, there were only 3 mechanisms for the government to raise money. One is by tax revenues, the other is by bonds, and the third is by government notes. And so that's how we're going to approach it. In the key right there in the middle of both figure 4 and figure 3, you can see at the bottom tax revenues, then that kind of lighter gray is bonds, and then that lightest gray or white is government notes. And that's the way we're going to approach this. So let's go down to figure 3 at the bottom, 1861. And you can see that there are some tax revenues. And that's the United States, 1861 and 1865. So in 1861, there was some tax revenue from the United States government. Because, obviously, they already had that all set up. But what I want to draw your attention to is the tiny little microscopic amount of money that's being drawn in from tax revenues. It's considerably less than, $50 million. It's like it's just a tiny little bit of money. So that indicates how small the government was in 1860, 1861 as we're coming into the war. Our government was tiny. It could be run on $50 million. And that's microscopic. Now, if we take a look at 1861 in figure 4, you can see that there's no tax revenues at all. And that's because the Southern Confederacy simply has not set up the infrastructure for tax revenue to be drawn and tax revenue to come in. Let's stick with figure 4 and go to the next one, 1862. They still don't have much in the way of tax revenues. 1863 and 1864, a little bit more. But it's still just over $100 million, just barely over $100 million if you look at the scale over on the far left. By contrast, let's see what's going on in the United States on the federal side, on the Yankee side, the Union side. 1862, they're still just a little bit over, maybe $60 million, something like that. But take a look at what happens subsequently. In 1863, it's going to go well over $100 million. 1864, nearly $250 million. And 1865, nearly $200 million. So tax revenue has gone way up. The ability to assess taxes and collect taxes has gone way up. That means that the government has grown exponentially. Please write that down. The ability of any one of these, either the Confederate or the United States government, to collect taxes means that the government is growing. So even the Southern government, which is depending upon states' rights as a fundamental cause, even they are like growing. The Confederate central government is growing. But looking at this, as you can imagine, the next thing we talk about is, and this is the big revenue stream, and that is bonds. Now, let me explain this for those of you guys who don't know. A bond is an interest-bearing device. Please write that down. A bond is an interest-bearing device. Back in those days, you could go to a large bank or you could go to the post office, and you could give cash money. That is critical. It had to be gold or silver. And you could give that to the U.S. government or to the Confederate government. And in return, they would give you this bond. Now, a bond looks like a big corporate check. I've only seen a few of these, and they're like just like a great big corporate check. And they have all kind of scroll work on them, and they have somebody's picture on there. But what's important? On the back side of the bond, it will say the repayment schedule. Now, the bonds come in different denominations, like $20 or $50 or $100 or whatever it is. And so you give cash for that. If you're in the Confederacy, obviously you're going to get a Confederate bond. If you're up in the North, you're going to get a Union. You're going to get a U.S. Treasury bond. And you'll buy that in the denomination, $20, $50, whatever it's going to be, $100 or whatever. And then on the back side, it will say, the repayment schedule. If you hold on to the bond for this many years, you'll get your $20 or $50 or $100 back plus this much money. And it will say that. And so if it says, okay, if you wait 10 years after the war, you'll get your $50 back plus another $10 or $15 or $20. So these are interest-bearing devices. But on an analytical note, please make a strong note here. On an analytical note, when we talk about people buying bonds, the individual is buying this, and he's gambling that his side in the war will win. His side is going to win. So take a look at the Confederacy. In 1861, a lot of people are enthusiastic, but, issuing bonds has only just started. So not much going on there. But take a look at 1862 and 1863. They're raising a vast treasure of money in bonds. There's a huge amount of money being raised in bonds. Because the people in the South feel that they're going to win, that they have a strong fighting chance to win. But observe what happens in 1864. They're saying, you know what, our chances of winning are like, that's not going to work. By contrast, take a look at what happens on the northern side in Figure 3. 1861, again, the war's only just started, so not many bonds. 1862, a lot of bonds are being sold. But compare that gray area, that middle gray area, with the middle gray area in 1863. They're almost identical. That middle slice, that middle gray area, they're almost identical. So in 1863, they did not sell appreciably more bonds than they did the previous year in 1862. So the feeling is in the North, this is people gambling with their money now, the feeling in the North is, hey, we may not win, so I'm not going to invest in my government. But then observe what happens in 1864. You can see that revenue streams from bonds go way, way up. And so the North is very confident that they're going to win. And then in 1865, you can see that a lot of people are buying these bonds in order really to get rich quick. In other words, you can get these bonds and then just hold on to them as an investment, and the investment is absolutely ironclad. So a lot of people are going to go out and buy federal bonds because everybody knows that bond sales will end when the war is over. We don't need that as a revenue stream anymore. So you buy bonds when the getting is good and hold on to them as an investment scheme. Yes? So last but not least, government notes. Now, when we talk about government notes here, all we're talking about, ladies and gentlemen, is just cranking up the printing press and putting more money into circulation. Now, you guys know, and I know, and I want to be clear on this, they knew then that just cranking up and printing a whole lot of money, just putting a lot of money into circulation, is inflationary. It's bad for the economy. You all know that. This is basic economics, and you know that that's bad stuff. So in 1861, they're going to print up a little bit of money. Okay, well, they're a new government. They have to print some, and they got to get that into circulation. 1862, they print up a whole lot more, but in 1863, take a look at what the Confederate government does. They print up a whole lot of money. We're in figure 4 now, that third bar from the left. And they're going to print up a whole lot of money. Now, the president of the Southern Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, knew that this was economically damaging. But he kept saying we have to do that to keep the war effort going. Strong note here. Jefferson Davis said repeatedly at length, as soon as the war is over with, they'll begin retiring all that money. They know that it's bad economically. So he says they will retire all that money in gold. That money will be backed in gold once the war is over with and victory's been won. And that will redeem the situation. That will redeem all that money in gold, and that will make it all right. He'll fix it. So what I want you guys to get out of it is that shows categorically that the South, that Jefferson Davis knew that printing up these government notes was inflationary, that was damaging. Now, with that in mind, let's go over and take a look at Figure 3. And again, this is the northern government, the federal government, the United States. And you see in 1861, they're not going to print up appreciably any more money at all. 1862, a little bit. 1863, a little bit more. 1864, as it turns out, even less. And 1865, almost none at all. So what I want you guys to get out of this on an analytical basis, when we take a look at government notes, U.S. notes being printed out in the war years, this is actually healthy. Lincoln needed to have enough money in circulation to keep the economy going. That's what you're looking at here. There's enough money in there. The economy was booming. People were making money left, right, and center because of the wartime economy. The Secretary of Treasury was a guy named Simon P. Chase. He knew exactly what he was doing. Lincoln had a lot of respect for him, and even though Simon P. Chase was prone to political shenanigans, Lincoln supported him and supported him and supported him because economically, Chase knew exactly what he was doing. So Chase kept control of the money that's actually in circulation, and he would only print out enough to keep the economy really booming. You had to have enough money for the ebb and flow of, buying and selling. And so when we talk about the fiscal health, again, Lincoln has a tremendous advantage. He's got a huge tax base that he can draw from. People are going to start buying bonds in big numbers. And he has a Secretary of Treasury that's going to keep tight control over, money matters. Whereas the Confederates, their situation is like really, really dangerous. They can't, depend upon a huge tax revenue. And that's true with any nation that has an agriculturally based economy. It's hard to draw taxes on that because it all depends upon, the planting season. But they're gambling. People are gambling that they're going to win. So money is available in the South, and they gamble that their side's going to win until it's clear in 1864 that they do not, that they're not going to win. So Davis had to resort to damaging his own economy by printing too much money. And even as late as, throughout the entire war, as it turns out, anyone in the South would still accept Northern coin money in exchange for goods and services. So, for example, if you had a $20 gold piece from the Union, from the American government, anywhere in the South, that was good money. People were going to take that. So really, in many ways, even economically, the South could never really separate from the Union. But boy, are they ever going to give it a try. So in conclusion on this, and then we'll move on to the next slide, once again, this is evidence that Lincoln had every advantage. And we're going to continue on to emphasize that in the next few slides. But he had a hard time like turning that into battlefield victory. So let's go take a look at, what all this money actually means. I want you guys to be able to put this slide into practical application. Now, as we take a look at the population, the total population in the U.S., and this is all statistics, the total population in the U.S. in 1860, a census year, was 31,200,000. Of that, in the South, there were 9 million. Of that, the slave population was right around 4 million. But take a look at the population distribution, which is on the map. And that shows that there are large cities, especially in the north, and that means a lot of manufacturing. Chicago, right at the very tip of Lake Superior, it's also a very large city in the Midwest. And so all these big giant cities, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then Philadelphia, lots of manufacturing going on there. Lots of manufacturing going on in upstate New York. A lot of manufacturing going on in Massachusetts. So here are a lot of places where a lot of manufacturing and large population groups are present in the north. But in the South, there's only really 2 places that have those black dots would indicate over 25,000. And that's Mobile, Alabama, way down there on the southern coast on the Gulf Coast, which was a large port city. And Charleston, South Carolina, again, which is a large port city. Well, as a reminder, during the Civil War, we're going to put the Navy out there and going to cut those ports off. So here are a lot of people that can't really, engage in any kind of business practices. And there's not a whole lot of manufacturing. So the population was largely rural in the South, but largely urban, that is to say city population in the North. And there's lots and lots and lots of manufacturing. So again, Lincoln has all these advantages. A huge population in the North to draw on for soldiers. A huge population to draw on for manufacturing. But he's going to have trouble turning that into battlefield victory. Let's continue on. Now, again, this is a little bit about image analysis. And this is a picture. It's just exactly what it looks like. No big deal, and there's not a trick going on here. But I want you guys to be thinking about what you really are looking at. It's one thing to gauge what you see, but what are you looking at? So in the foreground, there's a supply wagon. Okay, no big deal. But does anybody think that that's the only supply wagon that the North had? That thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of them. Immediately behind them, it's a whole bunch of, it's a bunch of cavalrymen. Some of them are on their horses, some of them are not, but there are a bunch of cavalry guys. So behind them is, I think, the James River, and there's a big giant pontoon bridge. Behind that, kind of on that little high ground over there, is a bunch of tents. That's for the engineers who are working on the pontoons. But what I want you guys to be thinking of is how much money is tied up in this picture. How much money is represented here? There must be, 70 or 80 horses here. How much money is that? How many saddles? 70 or 80 saddles. All the uniforms, bits, bridles, horseshoes. The wagons, there it is. It seems like a simple piece of equipment to us today. But, how much was that? How much money did it cost to make that thing? The pontoon bridge in the background. How much wood went into one of those pontoons? And then all the wood that went down, to form the actual bridge. And all the tents in the background. Those are not the only tents in the Civil War. So there's hundreds, there's lots and lots and lots of money involved in this picture. At first glance, a very, a common photograph, nothing going on there. But I want you guys to use your powers of analysis and figure out how much money is tied up just in this one little snapshot. Now take that idea and apply it to the next image. Now this is an artillery park in the Peninsula, 1862. We'll get to the Peninsula Campaign in a moment. In the foreground are a whole bunch of skids, and but immediately behind those skids, which it turns out are kind of hard to make out, they're upside down, they're railroad parts, but don't worry about that, are sort of an artillery piece called a mortar. Then in kind of the central right side of the picture, kind of in the background there, are a whole bunch of artillery guns. And those are big, giant siege guns. Those things are monsters. Then surrounding it all over there are all the artillerymen. Those are all the artillery guys. Now, I've mentioned this before in class. Let me mention it again one more time. Artillerymen are not born. They are made. You have to make an artilleryman. They have to be trained and trained and trained. They have to load the cannon right. They have to aim it correctly. The farther a target away is, the more elevation that you have to give the gun. It has to have the right powder charge. Everything has to be right with it. If you fire it a whole lot, very, very often, the gun will heat up. Then you've got to be able to allow it to cool down or it will explode. So artillerymen have to be trained and trained and trained and trained. And that means firing a lot of artillery pieces on a gunnery range and practicing and practicing and practicing. So imagine then just the investment that you have in those soldiers in the background. All the uniforms. There must be 1,000 guys there. All the uniforms, shoes, the tents and the food to keep those guys going. All their musket, shot, powder that they're going to have as part of their regular equipment. Then apply the same idea to all these cannons and these mortars in the foreground. How much iron, how much steel went into that? You know, it takes a special metallurgist to figure out the recipe for that metal. It can't just be iron. The first time it shot, it would simply blow to pieces. But it can't be steel because that was too expensive. People use bronze for a long, long time, but on a big gun like that, it won't work. It's too heavy. So you have to have, everything has to be just right to actually make the gun. Then you have to make the gun. So think of how many tons of iron and metal that you see in this picture here. Well, every bit of that had to be mined out of the ground. We've already talked about that. Everybody's got to go out there and they got to mine for that damn taconite. Then the taconite has to be sent off to a foundry. Then it has to be smelted out, and that takes a lot of coal. So the coal has to burn, it smelts out the iron, then somebody turns it over there and turns it into a cannon or a mortar. So think about how much labor went into this photograph, and not a shot has been fired at the enemy. Not a shot. And this is what all that money that we had a couple of slides ago, all that revenue, that's what it all means, ladies and gentlemen. This is where it becomes important. Strong note here. By 1863, Lincoln was spending $2 million a day on the Civil War. That is a statistical fact. By 1863, Lincoln was spending $2 million a day on the Civil War. Food, equipment, musket, shot, powder, pay for all those men, all the things that are necessary to keep that gigantic army that he had by 1863 in the field. Lincoln actually kept crunching those numbers. It drove him crazy. And he approached the South on several times on this. He had conversations about this. And he said, listen, make sure somebody in the South understands what I'm trying to drive at here. For the cost of like just a couple of months of the war, I could buy every slave in the South and then emancipate them. And then the problem that brought the war on would be over. It would be alleviated. But the South didn't want the money. They wanted their slaves. Lincoln approached it that way several times. As late as 1864, he's saying, listen, the numbers are clear. If I took the revenue that I'm having to spend on this war and bought all those slaves with the intention of freeing them, emancipating them that way, the war would be over that day, and it would be at a tremendous monetary savings. But the South insisted on fighting. So once again, I've mentioned this on several occasions. The South was ready, willing, and willing, and able to do anything to hold on to their slaves. But furthermore, Lincoln again had every economic advantage, but he couldn't turn that into battlefield victory. So with that in mind, let's progress. Now, what we're talking about here, we're going into the Peninsula Campaign. Now, on the south side, on the Confederate side, we're going to start with General Joe Johnson, but I'm not going to have a whole lot to say on him because he's going to get wounded, and that'll be the end of him. He doesn't leave the war, but he does lose an arm, and he kind of got fired because Jefferson Davis didn't like him. But that will lead us then to Robert E. Lee, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But Robert E. Lee emerges as one of the most revered figures in American history. He's going to be a general that we're going to study for many, many years to come. He had limited resources. I just got done talking about that. But he had one battlefield victory after another, after another, after another, after another. It's amazing what this guy was able to do, basically on a shoestring. Now, on the other side is George B. McClellan. There he is. I said I'd have his name spelled up there in a minute. Now I do. And he was on the Union side, obviously. Again, his nickname in the Army was Little Mac. He's a little short guy. And strong note here, his specialty was in training. He got the men in, he got them trained. He trained and trained and trained, and when he got them trained, he trained them some more. And he kept on training the men. And he turned them from basically a mob into an actual European-style army. A strong, well-disciplined, well-made European-style army. But of course, training up an army does not turn it into it doesn't fight battles. That's not the way it works. You've got to be able to fight the battles. So strong note here. While George B. McClellan was ready, willing, and able, and he did do a really good job on this, just train the army, he was not willing to actually go out there and fight. That's not a matter of personal courage. He had that. But he just couldn't bear the sight of, his men getting smashed to pieces on the field. He just couldn't bear up to that. He couldn't face it. But that's who Lincoln had, and he said very famously, we must use the tools that we are given. So he kept telling George B. McClellan, go out there and fight him, go fight him, go fight him, go fight him. On at least one occasion, he kind of joked and said, listen, if Mr. McClellan doesn't want to use the army, I'd like to borrow it for a while. Because he could not get George B. McClellan to fight. Now, he kept hounding George B. McClellan. He kept saying, listen, at least tell me what you're doing. And McClellan, was talking to Lincoln. At first, they got along together fairly well. But as time went on, this relationship soured. But McClellan, said to Mr. Lincoln, he said to President Lincoln, he said, listen, if I tell you there are so many spies up here and so many spies around, that if I tell you what my plans are, the South will know later that day. And Lincoln kind of rolled his eyes. He said, well, you know what? You kind of got me on that one. But he kept saying, you've got to go fight. It's important for you to go fight the enemy. So finally, Lincoln had had just about enough. And McClellan came up with a plan. So let's take a look at what McClellan has in mind. All right, so what we're talking about here is the Peninsula Campaign. So it's April, June, 1862. The Northern Army is led by George B. McClellan, who has trained up a huge, giant army. You can see it there, 100,000 men. He's trained them and trained them and trained them. Lincoln's been after him for months and months and months to like get out there and fight. He hounded him all through the end of 1861 and well into 1862. Finally, McClellan said, okay, I got a plan. I'm going to go out there and do this. On the other end, on the other side, on the Confederate side, it's going to be General Robert E. Lee. Now, to be clear, I'm trying to keep this as simple as I can for the purpose of this class. Technically, the general in charge in the South at the time was Joe Johnson. But he's going to get wounded in action pretty early on, and we only have to worry then about Robert E. Lee. And that's so I've just left Robert E. Lee here. Let's try to avoid confusion. Now, you can see that the two armies start to have a name, and they start giving names to the army. And George B. McClellan, he's going to be in control of the Union Army. A strong note here, or either keep this in the back of your mind. The main army of the North will be called the Army of the Potomac. For reasons associated with tradition, the Union Army will always name their armies after rivers. So you get the Army of the Potomac. Later on, there'll be an Army of the Cumberland, the Army of the Tennessee. There'll be different armies that'll have different names. But almost always they'll be named after some river or other. Robert E. Lee will be in control of the Army of Northern Virginia. He gave it that name, and that will be the main fighting force of the South. Not the only one, just the only one that really counts, the main one. There will be other armies for the South, and we'll run into some of those. But Robert E. Lee will be in control of the Army of Northern Virginia. At this point, 60,000 men. Now, the Peninsula Campaign is a campaign. This should already be in your notes. As you know, and it's written up there, a campaign is a series of battles that have a significant outcome. So the way we're going to approach this, we're going to go very quickly now. We're going to go to the map, and I'll show you what the plans were and then what actually happened during the campaign. But the result is George B. McClellan, ultimately, he's going to be defeated. And this means that Robert E. Lee, with fewer resources, much fewer resources, was able to do a whole lot better of a job and therefore be catapulted to the very top of the Confederate military hierarchy. But once again, our overarching idea is Lincoln had all these resources and could not translate that into battlefield victory. So let's go on to the next slide and figure out what's really going on with the Peninsula Campaign. Now the next slide, just settle in. It's going to take about 15 or 20 minutes to get through that slide. So let's go. Now, McClellan had the army up in and around Washington, D.C., training and training and training and training. New recruits would come in and he would train them. One time he told Lincoln, yeah, I can't go fight the enemy because we just got a whole bunch of new horses in and their mouths are all sore from having bits in their mouths. And Lincoln, you could just see him like rolling his eyes. But finally, he said to McClellan, you've got to go fight them. And McClellan came up with a plan. Ladies and gentlemen, it was actually a pretty good plan. The idea was to get all of his men, put them on boats and ships and steamships and like that, and sail them from Washington, which is kind of off the map directly to the north, down the Potomac River, and then land them, as you can see in the map, down at Fort Monroe, all the way down at the end of the York-James Peninsula. The big long peninsula is called the York-James Peninsula. It's got the James River on one side and the York River on the other, so the York-James Peninsula. So land his big giant army there, and then march straight up to Richmond, Virginia, capture the southern capital. The flags will be snapping in the breeze, the drums will be beating, it'll be great, and the war will be over. Well, Lincoln finally saw this plan, and he said, that's actually a pretty good plan. But what I want you guys to do is move fast. You've got to move quickly. And McClellan, again, you can just kind of see him rolling his eyes. Okay, yeah, we'll do that. So, sure enough, they got all their guys loaded up on ships. They got them down to Fort Monroe, on the very end of the tip of the York-James Peninsula. And everything went wrong from there. McClellan could not seem to, get moving. Roads that he had been assured were like all-weather roads that would be nice, they were turned into quagmires. Different assets that he needed, bridges and things of that nature, they were all destroyed. Now, one of the first Confederate commanders that McClellan ran into was a guy named John B. Magruder. And you can see his name up there, Magruder. Now, Magruder was a big fan of amateur theatrics, and he liked that a lot. He liked the theater. And he liked to see what he could do with the theater. He liked acting and like that. Well, the South could not have asked for a better guy to have on the spot at the time. John B. Magruder was a very active officer, and so he took the very few soldiers that he had, and he said, what I want you to do is walk around back and forth between, little areas of trees, and make yourself seen between these little copses of trees. Walk around behind some hills so that you're seen in the valley, crossing behind these hills. He told his guys, tie a bunch of branches and brush to your feet so that it stirs up even more dust. Then he said to a bunch of his engineers, what I want you to do is cut down a bunch of trees, skin the bark off them, and then paint them black. So that you have, a stick of a log, maybe 6 or 8 feet long. And then get broken down wagon wheels and put it on each side of that stick. And from a distance, it looks like a cannon. So when McClellan saw all this, he thought, man, I'm being completely overwhelmed. There's this huge, giant Confederate army with all these cannons all looking at me. And he's like, what do I do? So immediately he started sending telegrams and messages back to Lincoln. Oh my God, I need resupplies. I need reinforcements. We're about to be overwhelmed. Oh no, my goodness me, what do I do? And Lincoln, he get all these messages saying that, the Southern Army is gigantic, and then he's about to be swamped. Well, Lincoln sent a whole bunch of more soldiers down there. So this went on for a while until Lincoln said, listen, we're tapped out here. We don't have any more guys to send you. You've got to move forward. Give it a try. So finally McClellan said, okay, we'll try and launch an attack. We'll try that. And just as they got ready to attack and really hit these siege lines, I have it down there in that sort of wiggly line there, Magruder pulled out at the last second and got out of the way. So a lot of these Union guys are looking across the way there, and they're saying, hey, all the lines are empty. And they went over there, and they took a close look at these cannons, and they called them Quaker cannons. Quakers do not like war. So here's a cannon that can't hurt anybody because it's a painted-up log. Okay, so everybody got a big laugh out of that. Ha, 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 a little bit of a joke. But it made McClellan look really, really bad. What's important here, ladies and gentlemen, strong note, is that John B. Magruder, putting on this big theatrical show, gave the Confederacy more time. Well, so McClellan starts moving north, and he keeps going north, and he keeps going further north, and he keeps pushing further up towards Richmond. Now, please note on the map, McClellan splits his army in two, with one half on the north side of the Chickahominy Creek and the other half on the other side of the Chickahominy Creek. So, as I mentioned before, this is going to be a continuing problem with the North, that they split their army with a river in the middle, in this case, the Chickahominy River. Pardon me, I got a little bit of sinus problems today. So, to make a long story short, some of the fighting goes on, and Joe Johnston, who had been in charge, he got shot in the arm. He got shot in, I think, the left arm. Well, so he's carried out of the battle. And he very famously said later on, because it cost him his arm, they had to amputate his arm. And he very famously said later on that was the best shot fired during the Civil War, because it took him out temporarily. He will be back, but it put Robert E. Lee in charge. And Johnston said, Robert E. Lee had all the confidence that Jefferson Davis could give, whereas Joe Johnston, had no confidence at all from Jefferson Davis. So that put Robert E. Lee in charge. Now, once Robert E. Lee was in charge, he wasn't waiting around. He knew exactly what to do. He took a long, hard look at the map, and he said, okay, what I'm going to do is take my entire force and attack McClellan north of the Chickahominy River. So he called in all of his reinforcements. He got Stonewall Jackson to come in from the Shenandoah Valley, where he'd been fighting. And we have a series of battles. Now, this is a campaign. Now, I'm not trying to confuse you guys, but you can see there in the red where it says Confederate victories. Some of those were, in fact, Union victories, but then McClellan retreated. So, for the purpose of this class, I'm counting them all as Confederate victories, because after each one of these fights, McClellan's going to fall back. So we start up there with King's Schoolhouse, then Mechanicsville, then Gainesville, then Seven Pines. Then we get on the other side of the Chickahominy River, and we're at Savage Stations. Then Frazier's Farm and White Oak Swamp, and that was a huge fight. But by this time, McClellan and all of his guys that are with him, who are becoming more and more disgusted, all of his subordinate commanders are getting really mad with McClellan because he keeps winning, or occasionally will win, but then he falls back. Robert E. Lee, by contrast, cannot believe, what's going on here. He's outnumbered. Many times he's got fewer cannons, he's got fewer men. But every time there's a battle, McClellan, he's like, oh my gosh, we got to make a run for it. So they fall back, and Robert E. Lee just can't believe it. Finally, they get onto Malvern Hill, and they attack and attack and attack. The Confederacy does. It's unfortunate that Robert E. Lee got some poor information from his subordinate commanders, and they attack basically an impregnable position, and they get beat pretty badly. They lose a lot of the Confederates lose a lot of casualties at Malvern Hill. But that also convinces the North, that convinces McClellan that, Robert E. Lee has got him completely surrounded and is just about to close in on him. So when we talk about the Peninsula Campaign, George B. McClellan was simply outgeneraled in a big, big way. That is what I really want you guys to get out of the Peninsula Campaign. Again, Lincoln has all of these assets. He has all these positive elements, all these advantages, and can't get a general who wins. So finally, there's a lot of talk back and forth, and McClellan says, yeah, well, we can't move forward. And so Lincoln says, well, we're just going to withdraw you then. So they send a bunch of ships down to Harrison's Landing. They pick up McClellan and all of his men, and they take them right back to Washington, D.C. So this is a tremendous victory for the Southern Confederacy. This is huge. All right? Now, like all the other times before, McClellan is going to be the next general. So he lost throughout the Peninsula Campaign, and so he got fired. So please write that down on your list of generals. So we started out with Winfield Scott, who really couldn't do anything. He was just too old. He was too overweight, and he knew it. So he's out. But then we had Irving McDowell. He got beat at the First Battle of Bull Run. And now we get McClellan, and he's going to be beat in the Peninsula Campaign. Beat and beat and beat. Now, strong note here. We don't have time to talk about this battle later on, but there's going to be a second Battle of Bull Run, and that'll be John Pope. And John Pope was he was a big, burly guy, and he was very confident. And so Lincoln put him in charge. McClellan got fired, and so Pope was in charge. And Pope got beat at the Second Battle of Bull Run, so he's gone. And so we're going to continue on with this pattern of these Northern generals getting beat, and they get fired. All right? So with that in mind, we've talked about a battle. Let's go talk about other things. Now, we do have one other quick fight that I want to deal with very quickly. This is a Navy battle, and the battle itself is really meaningless, but the consequences of it are incredible. And this is the Battle of Hampton Roads. Now, it's not really a road. This is a nickname for that channel, that sort of port that you can see out there in the upper left. So the South had captured, when the war started out, the South had captured a ship that was partly built. It was a Navy ship destined for the U.S. Navy. And it was partly built, but, not completed. And then when the war started, they captured it. And they renamed it. It had been called the Merrimac, but they renamed it the CSS Virginia. And it's what was called an ironclad. And that picture on the lower left, it's the one that's kind of on the right side of that image, that sort of a wedge-shaped ship. So that's going to be the Merrimac. And what they did, they had a steam engine, and they're going to cover the upper part of it with a bunch of railroad iron and scrap iron. They put a bunch of guns in there. And so they have, what you and I would think of today as a modern battleship. Well, while that was going on, the North heard about all this, and they were like, they got spies too, and they can read the newspapers, and this is in all the newspapers in the South. And so they have to have an equivalent. They have to have the ship of their own that does this. And that leads to a rather eccentric guy named John Erickson. Now, John Erickson, he said, listen, I got the exact thing that you guys need, but he's really mad at the Navy. They smoothed things over, and so John Erickson made a ship, invented a ship, developed a ship called the Monitor. And that is it on the lower left, on the very left side of the image, that kind of flat area with that sort of round structure on it. You can also see the turret of the Monitor in that photograph on the upper right. So the Monitor had lots and lots of like brand new inventions on it, all sorts of patents on it. There were all sorts of like really interesting elements of it. Some people have said, well, it's a submarine. No, it's not a submarine. It's not, but it is very low to the water. And everybody at the time said, this thing's just going to sink. And he said, no, the water shall flow over it like a duck, and she will swim. And so, I'm sorry, she will swim, and the water will flow over her like a duck. And that's how he called it. He said it right. That's exactly what happened. So just as the Merrimack, the Virginia, she came out of harbor. She went out there and sank one of these U.S. ships that was on blockade out there. Destroyed it, sank it. All these other ships started like pouring on the fire and started shooting at it. The shots just bounced off all that iron. And so, without suffering a single casualty, the Merrimack, the Virginia, had scored this tremendous victory. Well, it turns out the very next day, the Monitor had sailed down from New York where she was built. And so she sailed up along. She got all ready to go. The sun came up. And then there's this titanic fight between the Monitor and the Merrimack. And they bang away at each other and bang it away at each other. And it's very much like the picture you see on the lower left. They're so close to each other, they run into each other from time to time. They're maneuvering hard. The Merrimack has got all its guns on the side and some that poke out the front. The Monitor has a rotating turret. 2 big guns, but they're in this rotating turret. So she can fire in any direction. Well, they pound away at each other for hours and hours and hours, and then they basically drift apart. So the fight itself was a draw. But the strong note that I want you guys to get out of this whole thing is that after this, every other ship and every other navy in the world is obsolete. The age of the modern steam-driven, propeller-driven battleship had arrived. And so, especially as you can imagine, especially the British were very nervous about this. They had a gigantic fleet. Some of their ships were still left over from the Napoleonic Wars. And nobody had challenged them on the sea like in hundreds of years. And suddenly all these magnificent vessels that they had this huge investment in are suddenly obsolete. So this is that's the importance of this fight. It has nothing to do with the battle itself, which was a draw. It has everything to do with, the bigger picture. What is a Navy going to look like in the future? So with that in mind, let's move forward. Okay, so what we're going to talk about now is contrabands. Now, note on your note taking, I mentioned this before, let me mention it again. We'll talk about a battle, and then we'll talk about other things. And what we want to talk about now is contrabands. Now, this is a phrase that is unique to the Civil War. It's only used in the Civil War. A student perked up when I was teaching this over at TWU one time. A student perked up and said, well, that's a racist phrase. No, it is not racist. It's only used during the Civil War. It's coined during the Civil War, and it is not racist. But the phrase contraband, for those of you guys who do not know, that means an illegal military product, an illegal war product. If you have an adversary and they're getting some sort of military product from someone else, that can be called contraband and then seized. It can be taken. So they're going to be referred to as contrabands. Now, more specifically, the Union had been like capturing a lot of land, capturing a lot of territory, and in the South. And with that comes all of these slaves. Well, as soon as they were captured, the slaves felt like, well, they were emancipated, they were freed. Now, technically that was not true, but politically, Lincoln kind of had to go along with that. Now, this put Lincoln in a very tight spot. They weren't really freed because he didn't feel like he had the constitutional power to do that. He did. He was just coming to realize it. But the abolitionists in the North were insisting that they were freed, and Lincoln should, acknowledge that. He should go along with that. So Lincoln was at a tight spot. Well, his problem was solved from an unlikely source, and his name was Benjamin Butler. Now, Benjamin Butler was a politician before the war. He'd never had any meaningful military training, but he was a very powerful politician. He'd been the Speaker of the House. He was from a state that was like providing a lot of equipment and men, Massachusetts. And so Lincoln basically had to make him a general, and a very senior general at that, because of his political position. But Benjamin Butler, he had what David McCullough very famously said, cross eyes and mixed motives, which is a really fun way to put it, but it was also very true, very apt. Anyway, Ben Butler coined the phrase contraband, and that gave Lincoln an out. It identified these African Americans, these slaves, as military equipment, as a species of military equipment. And then Lincoln could legally seize it. And so, Ben Butler didn't do a whole lot for the war, but he did do that. Now, later on, a Confederate guy, a Southerner, will come and approach Ben Lincoln. I'm sorry, not Ben Lincoln, but Benjamin Butler, and say, listen, don't you think that you have to return those slaves to their former owners because of the Fugitive Slave Act? And Ben Butler had the best answer for that. He said, listen, the Fugitive Slave Act only applies to the United States. And you guys are saying that you're seceding from the United States. That's a federal law for the United States. And you guys are saying that you've left the United States. And he very famously said, you must consider it one of the infelicities of your position in that you're being taken at your word. You said that you left the United States, so the Fugitive Slave Act does not apply to you. Which was also, again, very clever. So that's how things are going to proceed for a while. These former slaves, these slaves are going to be captured or come under Union control, and they're going to consider themselves to be emancipated, to be free. Now, what's important here, and we're going to do this a lot in the next series of photographs, we're going to use a lot of photographic images here, and I want you guys to, apply your powers of image analysis. Let's take a look at what you guys are seeing. Now, these are contrabands. We know that because the photographer, in this case Matthew Brady, wrote that on the back of the slide. He wrote that on the back of the picture. And so these individuals have been slaves hours, if not days before. Now, I want you guys to think of our thesis statement when we talked about antebellum slavery, that the South, what case did the South make? And they kept saying, listen, the slaves are not being treated as badly as you think. It's not, it's not this monstrous situation that you believe in the North. And so let's put that into practical application. And what I'm driving at here is take a look at these people and see if you see any wrecked up clothing, if you see any fraying, if you see any knees out in their pants. Or are they dressed as you would anticipate kind of the lower middle class, the very lower end of the middle class, in their workday clothing? You'll see that the women all have dresses on. None of it is all, ragged or anything like that. The men are clothed as working men would be clothed. Certainly, that child in the front, in the lower, what would it be, lower left, yeah, he didn't have any shoes on. Well, okay. In the first place, there's no paved roads back in those days. In the second place, a lot of kids went barefoot because they're growing, and you don't buy them shoes in order for them to have them grow out of their shoes. So most kids went barefoot back in those days. There's nothing odd about that. But they're not clothed in any way that's would indicate that they're being poorly treated. I cannot overemphasize this. That is their clothing. That's their stuff. They own it. And so these are the things that they would have on a day-to-day basis. This was not given to them by the Union. It was not provided to them by any other resource. They had been slaves, that was their clothing then, and now, thank God, they're free. Well, what does that imply about their condition as a slave? In other words, I'm not saying that slavery was good, slavery was evil. I cannot overemphasize that. But the South, did the South have a case, yes or no? Well, now you're looking at photographs of these individuals. Well, to be clear, one photograph is not enough evidence So, as it turns out, I have several. Let's take a look at another. Now, this photograph has been slightly retouched. The negative is a glass negative, and it was broken. So somebody has used modern techniques to kind of patch the picture back together. Otherwise, it'd have this big black splotch right through the middle of it. But this is a well-known photograph from the Civil War. And what's happening here is that the fugitives, these fugitive slaves, they made a run for it. And they're crossing the Rappahannock River in August 1862. Now, the key to their success, and I want them all to be successful in running away from slavery, God knows, is they have to be close to the Union Army. And in the foreground, you can see the artillery guys are watering the artillery horses. And there's a soldier in the front, very far extreme left. There's something else I want you guys to know about this picture. And take a look again at what's going on right in the center of the picture. We have a big giant wagon pulled by a 4-ox team. And there are these fugitive slaves making a run for it. Strong note here. In the South, nor either in the North, would anybody put up with these slaves looting. They would not put up with it. If the North thought that they looted this material, they would make sure that it got sent back to its owner. The slaves would not get away with that. If a Southerner was being looted systematically by the slaves so they could run away, people would stop that from happening. So that was not allowed. Neither side would put up with the slaves looting and then running away to the Union lines. That would not happen. So what I'm driving at is one way or another, that stuff, that big wagon full of all that stuff, and that 4-ox team belonged to those people. It is not stolen material, certainly not in 1862. That is not stolen material. That's their stuff. One way or another, they had acquired that. All right? So they've taken an opportunity, they've loaded up all their stuff into their little wagon, and they've taken off. And they made it to Union lines, and God help them. I hope they made it, they made it to freedom. But immediately, they become contrabands. Well, I don't think that photograph is enough evidence to show that, there's something different, to put photographic evidence to this previous idea that we had that, what case did the South make? So let's take a look at another photograph. So again, these are a couple of fairly well-known photographs. They've been out for a long, long time. They're published. And in the upper left, we see a contraband refugees in St. Louis in 1864, which is fairly late in the war. But again, the key to success is they have to be close to the Union lines. And sure enough, in the background on the right side of that photograph, the upper photograph, you can see a Union soldier on a horse. But what I want to draw your attention to then, this is a 2-horse team pulling a wagon. Now, it turns out, on a technical standpoint, that the wagon has a really long tongue, that pole that comes out there in the front of the horses, and that means it's set up for a 4-horse team. That's a separate issue. What I want to drive at, the horses, all the tack that belongs to the horses, the wagon, all the stuff that's in the wagon, and all those individuals there in the front, they are, they're free, God bless them, and they made a run for it. But that's their stuff. And none of the people, if you look at the photograph carefully, none of the people are dressed in anything that's like rags. Now, we could say that it could be nicer. Well, yeah, I suppose it could. But they didn't have washing machines back in those days. Washing clothes, and we've talked about this, is an extremely difficult business. But they're dressed in a way that you would anticipate for the lower middle class, and that's who they are. That's where they represented. That's where they're represented economically, not socially. Again, I've said this before. They're slaves. They're at the lowest end of the social order, but economically, they're lower middle class. Now, in the lower right, contraband labor gangs on the James River, 1862. And again, if you look very closely at the photograph, you'll see these guys. That is not clothing given to those men by the Yankees. It's not clothing given by the Union Army. It's not clothing given to those guys by Northerners. That's their stuff. Again, if you look carefully, they've all got hats on, which was common back in those days. They have white shirts. They have shoes and pants. They're dressed like ordinary day labor people. But in both these photographs, please understand that these people had been slaves hours, if not just days or maybe weeks before. That's their stuff. So in our mind's eye, we want Harriet Beecher Stowe's version of slavery to be correct. We want them to be dressed in rags and or mostly naked or this, that, or the other. But the photographic evidence does not show that. So, strong note here. This is what is important about contrabands as time goes on. Here is what is important. The union is going to start putting these people to work, especially the young men with a strong back and a strong set of shoulders. They're going to say, listen, come on over to our side, and we're going to put you to work. We will hire you. You'll be a part of the union army, and we're going to hire you as day labor, and we're going to pay you. And you do all the hard work. That is to say, what these guys in this labor gang is doing down there on that lower right photograph, they're loading and unloading ships. This is a task that has to be done. They're moving equipment. They're loading and unloading wagons. They're building tent cities. They're like transporting stuff from place to place to place. And so as time goes on, these contrabands become the labor force of the Union Army. Rarely, but occasionally, they'll be put to use building trenches, digging fighting positions and digging trenches, building bridges and maintaining pontoons. All the hard back-breaking work that has to keep the Union Army moving, these contrabands are going to start doing. And that is a tremendous asset. Continuing on with strong notes here. The contrabands become the labor force of the Union Army. They will be paid. But more importantly, this frees Union soldiers who would ordinarily have to do those tasks. It frees them up to go up and fight. So if you have 10 or 20 or 30,000 of these contrabands doing all the cooking, cleaning, transport, loading and unloading ships, doing all the backbreaking work, corduroying roads, whatever they have to do, then that frees up an equal number of Union soldiers who would ordinarily have to do those jobs. It frees them up so they can go up to the front lines and do the fighting. And Lincoln knew this. So he said, basically he wrote a little letter of thanks to Ben Butler for coming up with this idea. And then he said, put all these guys to work. Bring them into the Union lines and put them to work. Continue on with strong notes. This idea begins to permeate, the slave community, mostly by word of mouth, but also in the newspapers. But it begins to permeate the slave community in the South. And listen, if I can get close to the Union Army, I'm going to bolt. I'm going to make a run for it because those guys can put me to work. And I'll work for them rather than work for the Confederacy. Think. Because these former slaves are not working for the Confederacy, they're working for the Union Army, then that means that labor force was deprived from the South. This is what we call a zero sum. These people are going to be working, but they're no longer working for the South, they're working for the North. By working for the North, they're not working for the South. And that weakens the Southern war effort. Please make sure that gets into your notes. Well, as it turns out, I'm not satisfied with just 2 or 3 photographs of contrabands. Let's continue on and build a little bit more evidence. Now, these are, in the upper left, you see there, contraband teamsters. It is possible that those are actually black soldiers. But certainly, teamsters, those are the guys that they're running a wagon. They load and unload the wagons. They have to tie up all the, they have to hitch up all the mule teams or horse teams to the wagons all the time. And so being a teamster, that's actually extremely difficult, hard, back-breaking work. Now, it is possible that those are actual Union soldiers. They seem to have all the clothing of uniforms, but that could also simply be that they're in close proximity to the Union Army, and so they're wearing Union clothes. But the result is identical. They are working for the Union Army, and therefore they're not working for the South, and that is labor lost to the South. Down below, contrabands attached to the 13th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. Now, that was written on the back of the photograph, so we know for a fact that those are contrabands. And again, as before, look how they're dressed. They have dresses that are associated with the lower middle class, certainly. The first or second guy over there on the far left, they have overcoats on, they have hats, they have a tie. Those guys are, well dressed. Everybody has shoes. So that is their clothing. That is not clothing given to them by the Union Army or by, some charitable organization traveling down there to give clothes away to contrabands. That's their stuff. So again, this hints that, the South tried to make a case for slavery. There is no case to be made for slavery, but they kept saying it's not what you think. And this is a little bit of photographic evidence to try and, that might substantiate that claim to some degree. Now, as it turns out, I don't know, 4 or 5 photographs, that may not be enough. Let's try one more. Now, take a careful look at this photograph. We know what's going on here. An Army cook, City Point, Virginia, 1864. Now, this is probably a soldier, but possibly not. In other words, no part of his clothing is really part of the Union uniform. It's not. So I put this photograph in, again, to show that here this guy is. He's cooking. He's got a fire going, got a big giant log up there going. He's got a bunch of food that's being boiled up, beans or whatever it is. You can kind of see he's got a spoon stuck in the top of his boots. And in class, I talk to everybody. And I say, well, now what do you think about the way this guy is dressed? And everybody points out, yeah, that guy's got a big pair of really strong, shoes, really strong boots. And again, this is this whole idea. That's not something he got from anybody place else. He had been a slave hours, days, maybe months before. But he took the money that he earned as a contraband or as, quite possibly, I don't think so, but quite possibly as a soldier, and went out and got himself a good, strong pair of boots. There's no fraying in his clothing. His elbows aren't out. The knees aren't out in his clothing. He's dressed like anybody else would be dressed under those circumstances. Now, the reason why I don't actually think he's a soldier, his hat is not a military hat in any shape, fashion, or form. And you can see that he has a sort of a vest on under his jacket. And that was not Army issue at all under any circumstances. Like, nobody had that. So I'm pretty much convinced that that is actually his clothing. That is his clothing. But the other thing I want you guys to get out of this photograph, like all the others, these contrabands are performing a critical role for the Army, the Union Army. They are performing a critical task. They are doing things for the Union Army that would otherwise require a Union soldier to do. And because the Union soldier didn't have to do those things, you can go up to the front lines and fight, which is what, that's what the Army needed. So, contrabands, they perform this tremendous role. In conclusion here, they perform this tremendous role. There is an active participation of these unfortunate individuals, these slaves. As soon as they were ran into the Union Army, they were basically emancipated. They were freed. They were liberated. They were no longer really slaves. And when we get to the Emancipation Proclamation later on, then that kind of solidifies that under the Constitution. We will talk about that. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. Now, this is the last slide in this series. I'm looking at the clock here, and I think this ran 2 hours and 20 minutes. It actually ran a lot longer than I thought it would, but that's the way it goes sometimes, and I don't know how YouTube is going to react to this. But in the next series, it'll be 1863 to 1865. It'll be Antietam. We've talked about other things, and we're going to talk about a battle, so we'll start out with Antietam. Then we'll talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. We'll have 2 really short fights, Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. They were important, but in the context of this class, we just have to get through them. Then we'll talk about, for a long time, we'll talk about the wounded, and that's medical care during the Civil War. For those of you guys who are taking my class, you will certainly have that as a test question. I promise you. That will be an essay question right there. So when you see wounded during the Civil War, I'll talk about that extensively. That'll probably run nearly an hour just by itself. Then we'll talk about a battle, Gettysburg. Then again, we'll talk about other things. We'll talk about draft riots and U.S. colored troops in the Civil War. So that concludes this 2 hour and 22-minute segment. And I will see you on the next part 2 of the Civil War. Thank you very much.